Gambling is one of the biggest issues to be tackled by the legislature this year. It could allow destination resort-style casinos in South Florida and allow a voter-supported expansion with slot machines at Melbourne Greyhound Park. Former Senate President Mike Haridopolos of Merritt Island says billions of dollars in state revenue is at stake, depending on what it decides. In a Florida Today column, he cautioned that the addition of casinos has to be done right, or it could undo the state's lucrative compact with the Seminole tribe. And he says the special interests have mobilized. I asked Haridopolos into the Florida Today studio to break down the issue as only a former top lawmaker could. Mike, thanks for joining us here today. Let's talk about gaming here. There's a major rewrite underway of the laws in the state. There's negotiations happening with the Seminole tribe, and now there's a lot at stake. Why don't you give us the lay of the land here?
Well, first of all, it's a very complex issue. It's not as easy as no casinos or yes to casinos. There's a lot of moving parts. But the big picture right now is about money. About almost $500 million comes into the state through what's called the Seminole Compact, also from what they call parimutuel. Parimutuel, for example, is right down the street, Melbourne Greyhound Park, big poker room. There's almost 30 of those around the state. But what we're asking is two basic questions. One is, should we bring in destination resorts, meaning are we really getting the most bang for the buck? I think there's a lot more than almost $500 million there, but you have to be careful in how you negotiate, because one new resort could affect the existing compact.
Let's explain that compact for a second,
Sure.
because it's more than just a tax that we're charging on the Indian tribes, you know, for them to have the Hard Rock casinos and that kind of thing. It's something else. What is the compact?
Yeah, I'll try to explain it like I would in the classroom. The compact is important because remember the Seminoles and Miccosukee Indians we're talking about right here, they're sovereign nations. They're not citizens of the state of Florida. They're sovereign nations. We have to negotiate with them on this issue. So what we negotiated back in 2007, took effect in 2010, is this. We will offer exclusive games to this sovereign nation, meaning the Seminoles and the Miccosukees, in this case, Baccarat and primarily blackjack.
Okay.
In exchange, they will give us amount of money over the course of 5 years. So it's a 5-year deal, 2010 to 2015, a minimum of $1 billion over those 5 years. But there's also other incentives written within the bill that if they generate even more money goes into the state.
Okay.
So, for example, instead of $200 million coming in on average, last year we saw $233 million coming into the state and local governments.
Wow.
But that's a compact, which is the key word I talked about the other day, called exclusivity. If we don't, or in this case the Seminoles or the Miccosukees don't have exclusivity, meaning we give Baccarat and blackjack to other facilities, they no longer have to pay the state. So that's the contract. It's not about taxes, it's about we give you exclusivity, in exchange you give us money. That's the contract. And at this point right now, Rick Scott, our new governor, is negotiating a new potential extension of that compact. It could be for 5 or 10 or 20 years. We don't know yet. Those are private discussions going on. But in my opinion, it should be a boost to our state, and I think we'll get even more money out of a future compact.
That's a tremendous amount of money. I mean, we're talking about an incredibly profitable industry, aren't we?
We really are. And this is why the tax rates being discussed for the other side of this coin, which is called destination resorts, are usually somewhere between 25 and 35% tax rates on these new facilities.
Wow.
And our guess is this. I mean, there's some serious players here. It's the usual suspects, Steve Wynn, Sheldon Adelson. A new player, a Malaysian company called Genting, is playing big time. They purchased the old Miami Herald property right there on the water in Miami downtown. And so all these people are looking, saying, Florida's the place to be. I mean, candidly, do you really want to go to Mississippi or Illinois or Iowa to game? No, you're going to want to go to beautiful Florida, and by the way, maybe gamble. What we're going to look at is, if we create a destination resort down in South Florida, 1 or 2 or 3, whatever it might be, will that not only bring in more money as a whole, but we don't want to undercut what we're already getting. That's the real touchy nature of this. If we bring in destination resorts, meaning casinos, will we lose that exclusivity contract we have currently with the Indians, meaning we'll lose that $250 million, and will we make up for it if we have a new contract? It's very complex, and what I would call a domino effect. If we create that deal, it could undercut our current deal.
Pardon me. So it raises a question of, do the Indian tribes fall under the new regulatory scheme, or are they out of it completely?
We'd have to, again, set up a separate contract or compact with the Indians because they're a sovereign nation. All the other parimutuels, that means Hialeah, that means Tampa Bay Downs, the racetrack, that means Melbourne Greyhound Park.
Sure.
All these folks will fall into the state law because these are state-run entities regulated by our Department of Business and Professional Regulation, just like any business across Florida. The unique part of this compact is that would be negotiated because you're dealing with almost a federal entity. So that would be a separate contract, and what we're wondering is probably two things. What exclusive games would we give the tribes to extend that contract? Or maybe you give them exclusive jurisdiction, meaning they would have jurisdiction maybe the Tampa area and the Broward County area. So it could be both on games and it also could be on areas. Of course, the Seminoles, they're the major player here. They want everything. They've got everything now.
Right.
But they also want a longer contract because, like with any business, if you only have a 5-year contract, what happens in the out years? So that's the complexity. I'm hopeful that the governor, who's a very good negotiator, I've seen it personally, can get something better for the state there, and maybe even either bring in destination resorts, which is a possibility, or make it where some of the existing parimutuel facilities maybe have a better sense of atmosphere so that there will be people coming from the East Coast of the United States or Central and South America to exclusively go to those gaming resorts.
Kind of like a Vegas situation, only with a Florida style.
It is, and we want to limit it. I mean, the Florida voters spoke 3 different times, definitively saying no to casinos. 1978, 1986, 1994. Overwhelming majority said no to casinos. Yet, in 2004, the voters by a 51-49 margin said yes to slot machines down in Miami-Dade. But the key was, and you and I know this, is they said the money would go to where? Education. The same reason why we passed the lottery back in 1986 as well. And so there usually needs to be some type of tie-in saying, if we choose to take this risk, which is a risk with casinos, it changes the look of Florida around the world, what benefit do we get? What are the cost-benefit analysis of it all? And that's what we're always trying to weigh. Disney's saying, no way, no how. It undercuts Florida's family-friendly atmosphere, whereas other people in South Florida are saying, hey, we can bring a lot more money into this state, a lot more tourists into this state if we offer a destination resort already on top of what we have in Florida.
For the Disneys of the world, is it really just about family friendliness? I mean, I think I saw a report that said that most conventions, most of the major conventions go back and forth between Las Vegas and Orlando. One's for gambling, one's more the family-friendly and golf kind of a situation. Mm-hmm. Are they concerned that they might have one of those major regional competitors right here within Florida, that it's not just the family-friendliness, but you might have an alternative type of convention area with gambling in South Florida as opposed to what we have right now in Florida, with Orlando really being the dominant hub for that kind of thing? Well,
I'm sure that's one of the dynamics, there's no doubt. When I was running for office, I love to have no one running against me. That's a great step. McDonald's and Burger King are dreaming of the same thing. And I think that's part of it. And that's the mix. I mean, Universal and Disney are competitors, but they're unified in this effort. That's the question we're going to run into. But this is pretty even fight as far as the finances are concerned. Major players are all putting in. You have the Indian gaming groups contributing. You have the traditional casinos contributing. You have Disney and those folks. And so when James Madison talks about the idea of the Constitution and competing interest groups, there's plenty of those in this fight. What I want to hope for, and what we looked to do a few years ago, is let's just make sure that taxpayers get the best deal. My goal was we need some more revenues because we have such a budget shortfall. Maybe in this time we have a balanced budget and still needs in education and healthcare. Maybe it even means by getting more revenues out of casinos, or at least this whole gaming industry, it might mean lower property taxes or tax cuts somewhere else along the line. These are all the moving parts that are in place.
Now, from the state perspective, when it comes to regulation, there has to be some sort of new scheme, right? There needs to be a new oversight office or something, because with casinos, the potential for corruption is pretty high, isn't it?
Absolutely. And as you know, my dad's a former FBI agent, and I grew up, I remember my dad used to go to Oak Lawn Park in Arkansas when he was an agent in Arkansas, and there was a lot of risk, and they had to really have the oversight. Right now, we have what's called DBP, our Department of Business and Professional Regulation, but most people believe that if we go to this next level, we should have what they have in Las Vegas, which is a gaming commission. Experts, well paid, making sure there's no corruption, there's no conflicts of interest. Very important, because if you're not careful, you can run into all types of problems like they had more recently in Atlantic City.
Asia's got its share of gangsters and others who, Macau and some of these places are sort of famous for that, and the potential is pretty high. Let's talk a little bit about who some of these interest groups are a little bit. The Seminole tribes here. I mean, I don't think when they first, maybe 15 years ago, we thought about them as being political players. Are they now?
They sure are. They're major political players. One of the biggest backers of Charlie Crist when he was the governor of the state of Florida. And he was one, of course, initiated that deal a few years ago, which forced the legislature to act. For years, Jeb Bush had kind of pushed off the idea. Charlie aggressively negotiated it. Eventually, the House and Senate came in and finalized the deal that secured that $1 billion over 5 years. They are a major player. And as we spoke about earlier, here's the interesting part. Should these destination resorts come in and are offered the same games the Seminoles currently have, in essence, the Seminoles will have no tax rate, and they'd have a much better business competition level. When one is giving a 25, 35% tax rate, they're paying no taxes. Of course, they could put all their money back into a more enhanced facility. So there's that internal competition, and a lot of people are wondering, is that fair, is it not fair? That's why I think it's important that Rick Scott, when he negotiates this deal, knows all the moving parts. To his credit, he does know the moving parts. And I think it's in everyone's best interest to continue that Seminole Compact. But let's try to get more out of it. And hopefully this will also allow us to at least improve the quality of the gaming in Florida. Again, we're a gaming state. Anybody who says we're not is not looking at reality. But we have some of the facilities that aren't exactly tourist attractions. And I think a lot of people that I've spoken to across the state would say, I'm okay with casinos if it's first-class stuff. We don't want some of the shady or underfunded places. If we're going to do this, let's do this right. Let's maximize new tourists coming in as opposed to the current venues just pulling off existing Florida residents.
When you say we're a gaming state, what do you mean by that? I mean, we have the Hard Rock casinos. I think we have some casino cruise ships and the like, but what does that mean?
We have almost 30 pari-mutuel facilities. That means high-lie, that means dog tracks, that means poker rooms, that means horse racing, that means simulcast where you can bet on races across the world. We have the Indian gaming that you spoke about. We have all these facilities. And so some people say, we got to say no to casinos. I use the term, it's not the most polite term, but there's no such thing as being half pregnant. I mean, we're already here. The argument that I made a few years ago is if we're already doing it, and the voters of Brevard already said yes to of course, the poker and so forth here, let's do it right. Let's really try to build something that attracts people from around the world, brings new tourists in, as opposed to just kind of being a local area that just maybe Floridians would be betting on. We want to bring that outside money in. It's one of the great things about Florida. We had a record tourist year, as you know, this year, and that means a lot of out-of-state, out-of-country money coming in where we're not paying for their schools and other health care needs. Instead, they're putting in about 25% of all of our sales tax revenue because we have that large number of tourists coming in.
So really go for sort of the Monte Carlo approach, right? So where you have the Brazilians and people coming into Miami or someplace. One of the things I heard in terms of ideas was that we might have some zone or something where it could only happen in 3 counties in South Florida or something like that. Mm-hmm. What is that about?
That's very accurate. I think a lot of people are saying if we're going to do it, let's limit it to one place. And that place most people agree with best for the revenue and the tourists and so forth would be Miami. And that's why Genting, this Malaysian gaming player, has made a huge investment in Florida, very much playing in the politics of Florida. They believe that that is a mecca where their clients from the East Coast of the United States, let alone the south part of the United States, Central and South America, would say, I'm going to go to Miami. I can bring my kids there, have a great family time, and if I choose to go gamble at night, fine. But they want to go to that 5-star resort. So we're looking at basically almost like a bidding process. At least that's the Senate bill currently, that 2 resorts would come in. There'd be a minimum of like $2 billion spent on the building or structure, which in turn would probably meet that definition you talked about earlier with the competition with Disney or Orlando. But the idea that you'd be building a mega facility, first-class facility, not one of these small facilities that sometimes exist across Florida.
Now, would that squeeze out places like Melbourne Greyhound Park, Club 52, some of these other pari-mutuel facilities around the state that went out and got voter approval to add slot machines and maybe I think they already have poker rooms, but to add slot machines so that they can build in Melbourne a Hard Rock style kind of resort and parking garage and all that kind of thing.
Well, that's a good question. My guess is that I bring the Club 52 guys in there first, but my guess is a lot of those folks who play regularly there would not take the 3.5-hour drive to Miami unless it was a vacation type scenario. I think you're going to have their regular players there, so to speak. But it also opens the door for another moving part of this very complex issue, which is what they did in Pennsylvania, for example. They allowed casinos in Pennsylvania, but they gave a certain percentage of those new revenues that came into the horse industry so they can build up their purses so that better horses came to race on their horse tracks in Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
So the idea might be here as well, that the greyhound tracks and or the horse tracks would get a percentage of this new revenue brought in, which in turn would improve the quality of racing in Florida and would help the industry. And remember, it's not just the Calders and the Gulfstreams and Tampa Day Downs. There's also Ocala. Ocala is a major place for breeding and training world champion horses, meaning Triple Crown winners. So Florida is a big horse state, and the idea maybe a small percentage could go to build up those purses. They already have the very big race each year called the Breeders' Cup, happens here or at least every other year in Florida. Maybe that would enhance the already strong facilities here. So that's another moving part. And maybe again, a certain percentage goes to the existing pari-mutuels to upgrade their facilities. This is why it's so complex. How does a senator or representative vote on one issue, wondering what you just did? How will it affect the people who are employed in my county who work at one of these places or derive some local revenues from it?
Yes, so as I understand it, I mean, we voted here to allow the Melbourne Greyhound Park to add slots, which would increase this big, but that vote is technically moot because the legislature had already decided to rewrite all the gaming laws, and if that were to happen, the legislature would have to allow the vote to be grandfathered in somehow to let that expansion happen. It sounds like this is all being discussed, written, voted on in committee up in Tallahassee now.
It is. And again, I hate to use the term over and over, but it's complex and there's a lot of moving parts and you never know. The House and Senate are so far apart right now. A lot of people think nothing will pass. And the only thing that could happen is the new compact with the Seminole Indians. But that's I know in a couple years ago when we had our major budget issues, the Senate had kind of come up with this destination resorts plan. The House basically said thanks, but no thanks. And you need dance partners. And as you know, the Senate is more pro-gaming. The House is more, I would call it, socially conservative. Plus, there's a big impact that Disney and the Central Florida amusement industry has on those state House members. So I think what you'd see in the best case scenario for Melbourne Greyhound Park is that they would hope that if a new bill is passed, they would give the power for a new referendum to be formed, and maybe they get slot machines that way. I know right now in speaking with the owners of the Club 52 and others that they're doing well with their poker room, but like any business, they want to expand, they want to attract new tourists, they want to bring in new players, not just the ones they have here locally.
How does Governor Scott go and negotiate something with the Seminoles, not knowing what the legislature is going to pass later this year?
Well, one is it's TikTok. I mean, it sounds funny, but that's the legislature start, and then if you don't have something moving in the legislature by the start of the legislative session, it's really tough to pass a bill. In my experiences, the bills that pass are the ones that are making it out of committee back in January and February, well before the start of the March session. And I think it's incumbent upon the governor to be prepared. I mean, this compact ends in 2015, and it's bringing a lot of money to the state, and it's bringing a lot of money to the Seminoles. I think he is a good negotiator. I think he wants to have a deal in place so we can better plan for the needs of the state. And we had them in health care. We're still a big push, especially here in Brevard County, for increased funding for K through 12. We want to keep the Bright Future Scholarship going. I mean, there's just a lot of pressing budgetary needs. And should he renegotiate a better deal for Floridians, that will fill some of those needs, and it might allow for some of the tax cuts that he'd like to institute as well.
The lottery is something that I hear about a lot these days because, again, you know, the voters in Brevard are contemplating a sales tax for capital needs for schools. Question comes up again. Whatever happened to the lottery? What did happen to the lottery? Is the money from the lottery still going to education, and if so, how?
Well, as you know, the lottery passed in 1986, took effect in 1988, and since 1988, they've generated $26 billion, with a B, $1 billion to public education. what frustrated a lot of people in the early days of the lottery is that they did kind of a bait and switch where they would, yes, put that new money into education, but then they moved some of the existing money out of education for other budgetary needs. So the way that you've changed that recently is that in 1997 we created the Bright Futures Scholarship, and every parent in Brevard knows all about this one. And it served over 600,000 students, and it provides, I think last year's budget had about $430 million went to the Bright Futures Scholarship. And so of the $1.3 billion that's generated from the lottery each year, for a total of $26 billion since 1988, about $430 million goes to Bright Futures. So that's specifically added for that. So the money's going to education. I think, at least in my tenure in the legislature, we kept that money in education. But the pressure here is that tuition is going up. So when tuition goes up, the cost of Bright Futures goes up.
I see.
And that's the pressure point. So if you want more money for education, that's the catch that's involved.
And some of it goes to the class size amendment too, correct?
The remaining, what's that, $800 million still goes to K through 12, and a lot of it goes towards the class size initiative. And again, when we made our adjustments in the class size initiative, our case was, it's not the size of the class, it's the performance of the class. So let's reward performance as opposed to having some magic number. If you and I found out that with 18 students in a classroom, you'd have these super students, we'd do that. But the literature, let alone the research, hasn't shown that specifically. But more importantly, to your point, $26 billion has gone to education because of the lottery. But some people are still critical of that, saying that's gaming in another sort.
One of the unique things about Brevard County, I know you had some experience with this in trying to cope with pollution from the ships or not. This was the casino cruise ships. Mm-hmm. Now, technically, they're not, would they fall under this gaming regulation, or is the fact that the ships can kind of go outside of U.S. waters and then come back in, make them their own animal?
They were their own animal. I was very suspicious of it. This goes my dad's FBI background. I didn't like those ships because we didn't know what the heck was going on there. No revenues were derived to the state. Yeah, a few folks made some money at the port, but it was not regulated. We were not bringing in money to the state. Who knows what was happening out there? And then to cap it all off, all the pollution that was coming off the ships, the bill that I'd worked with Stan Mayfield and others back in the House and Senate days. I didn't like those. I think those are becoming a thing of the past, because why go out on a cruise ship if you can do a lot of that right here at Melbourne or up to Daytona, or potentially go down. So they've not been the vibrant industry they thought they'd be. But I was just not so comfortable with them, because any business has to pay taxes. They really weren't paying based on the activity that they performed. And the other one is that I think that any gaming should be well regulated for the examples you talked about earlier with the organized crime and the other social issues that come with gaming at times.
You advise Governor Scott on political issues still from time to time. Are there political implications for the governor or for former Governor Christ related to this issue in the governor's election?
Well, I think it will be. Any issue is alive and well in the governor's mansion. I think the great news for Rick Scott, of course, is when he took office, high unemployment rate, big deficits, now running for re-election, the unemployment rate is almost cut in half, and of course they have a balanced budget. But there's other issues that will affect voters, and my guess is if he can, in essence, negotiate even a better compact, that would serve him well in politics. And I think all legislators are looking for a better deal at that compact, because the Seminoles are doing quite well, and I think that taxpayers should get an even better share. That's the hope. And in exchange, we'll give him a longer-term contract. I think that's what the governor's going to try to achieve, and I think if he's able to do so, it would be a boon for his campaign.
And are they pretty good players to deal with, the Seminoles that we've been negotiating? I mean, why was there such a need under the Christ administration to negotiate this in the first place? Were they just going to roll and go ahead and launch casinos without our permission, or without the state's permission? I know they're sovereign somehow. It's just
Well, they were pushing for it pretty hard. There were fights in the past with the Democratic Attorney General Bob Butterworth about what they could and could do. There was actually a time where they blocked off the road to the facility. It was really interesting stuff. I would say this, when the governor first negotiated a deal, those of us in the legislature felt that we were being shortchanged. So we got more involved in the process, and I think we helped negotiate a healthier deal for the state of Florida back in 2007. I hope, especially given the success of the model, that Rick Scott can build upon that. And I think Floridians have kind of accepted, look, it's here. It's an up-and-up facility, and you asked the question, what do they like to deal with? I found them to be very straightforward. They're tough negotiators, no doubt, but they have run their facility where they haven't had some of the problems or incidents that have happened in other states.
You don't hear about it very much. How would you handicap the chances of some kind of major gaming regulation and legislation passing this year? You mentioned that the House and Senate are pretty far apart.
I still would bet, literally bet against it this year. I think there's a good chance that a Seminole Compact could be reached. Well, again, we'll have to see over the coming months. But I think it's just a really difficult spot. What I've seen in the past, again, from my 12 years in the legislature, was oftentimes, even when there's a mood to do something, the gaming industry starts to fight among itself, among who gets what, and it kills the bill. That could happen again this year. And if I had a bet on it, I'd say it wouldn't pass. But I'm hopeful that they can work something out because there's a lot of money on the table, and it would be great to see those additional dollars come into the state so that we could plug some of our budget holes or provide some additional tax relief.
And we certainly don't want to lose what we've already managed to get from the Seminole Compact.
Well, as my wife would say, you know, first rule, do no harm.
Right.
That's one of the things that I think, again, that's why I think the likelihood is we won't pass a bill, and that hopefully an enhanced Seminole Compact would at least bring us additional money in. But that's the concern. There's a lot of dominoes here, and I hope I haven't been too complex for the listeners today, but that's why it's not as simple as yes to casinos or no to casinos. If you say yes to casinos, you're also taking some money off the table from the Indians, and we need to be very careful how we handle that.
Mike Haridopolos, thank you so much for explaining things for us today.
I'll try my best. Thank you.
Well, that's our program. As always, we welcome your opinion on gaming or any other issue you see on this program. Send an email to us at letters@floridatoday.com. I'm Matt Reed. We'll see you right here next week on WEFS TV and FloridaToday.com.